Good afternoon. Kathleen Sidlecki with Weber Shandwick Communications. Building on the earlier question about our challenge with advocacy for investments in vaccines, I think that I'm just interested in the panel's point of view that when it comes to success stories, as you said earlier, it's very tangible for people to understand. I gave $10 for a bed net for malaria or the President's Malaria Initiative. But when you look at the promise of new vaccines, I mean, I think that's part of the challenge, is that how do you make the case and talk about success stories for investments in vaccines when it may be 5-10 years down the road. Hopefully sooner for some things, but just curious about your perspective on that.
I would just start off by saying that Gavi is a success story. I mean, they've only been in operation for 10 years. Is that? The estimates are that for a variety of vaccines, that perhaps 5 million lives have been saved. This is it frustrates me a little bit. Almost no Americans know about this institution. It's a model in a lot of ways. It's not a top-heavy government bureaucracy. It has a private aspect. It's doing fantastic work, and they're just having their commitment conference this month, I think, in London, hosted by Bill Gates and David Cameron. But just telling that story would be a tremendous advantage, it seems to me, because it's happened very, very recently. So.
There's actually a great story that would be worth everyone knowing. It's a program called Meningitis Vaccines. So meningitis vaccines are commonly available in the developed world, but there are many, many strains of meningitis, and they're highly localized. There's a strain of meningitis C that's a killing strain in Africa, for which there had been no vaccine, because it's a unique strain and there was no profitable motive for a company to invest. So about 10 years ago, an initiative that was involved PATH, involved the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and involved an Indian company called the Serum Institute, came together along with technology out of the FDA, actually. The basic technology came from FDA, the manufacturing technology came from Amsterdam. This was part of a public-private partnership. A decade later, we now have an approved vaccine that has been rolled out in, I think it's Burkina Faso, is the initial rollout. But in any case, they immunized over 10 million people this fall. And the number of cases has gone from an expected number of cases of 2,000 to 4. All 4 of those have been traced from outside of the immunization area. This is literally people who weren't in Burkina Faso but migrated in looking for health care. So there are tremendous examples of successes of research-based efforts that lead to vaccines, and we see enormous results. So we probably just need to tell more of those stories.
There's also the historical story you can tell. I mean, that a lot of Americans, not younger Americans, but a lot of Americans still remember. I mean, through the 20th century, I've used this column and figure in a column once, but you had about 650,000 people die each year throughout the 20th century from diseases like measles and polio and smallpox and diphtheria and rubella and diseases like that. And now those are in the hundreds every year. It's one of the most extraordinary health gains in human history that we all experienced in developed countries through the advance of vaccines. So I think telling that historical story is also a good one too. So.
We have one here and then here.
Dick Tubb, a physician under the Clinton and Bush White Houses. Looking at the broader question of vaccine technology, research, development, and bringing to market vaccines, what can the people in this building do from a policy perspective, not from a grant or financial perspective, but from a policy perspective to facilitate the broader question of bringing vaccines to market, which then will impact each of the vaccines that you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the most important contribution is the one that you excluded that I can talk about, which is the funding, because without the funding, it won't happen. But certainly, from a policy perspective, there are many other ways to encourage R&D. There are tax incentives, R&D tax credits, et cetera, that will give the incentive for companies to invest in this area, or for foundations or not-for-profit agencies to invest in vaccine research. So certainly a supportive role to understand what are some of the barriers and how can we, from a legislative policy perspective, address those barriers. And other things have been done in the area of incentives. I forget the exact terminology that was used, but fast track approval was granted to a company who came out with, I think it was a technology for an orphan disease. And so there are things like that that companies will look at and say, hey, that makes sense, that will help my ROI analysis, because I don't think that there's a company out there in the biopharmaceutical industry that doesn't have leaders who want to make an impact. If all they want to do is make money, there are a lot of other industries where it's a lot easier to earn a living than the biopharmaceutical industry, especially over the past 5 to 10 years. So they want to make an impact. On the other hand, they're publicly traded companies for the most part, or private, venture-backed companies, and they need to see an ROI. So I think that there are certainly policies that can help to address that you're all even more familiar with than I am. And David, since you've addressed this area before, I'll let you add on as well.
Sure. I think what's commonly not well understood is that if you take the pie of biomedical investment, globally about 35%, maybe even 40% of biomedical investment actually comes from governments. And private industry takes the last 60 or 65%. And there's really a very nice division of labor of basic discoveries occurring in academia, some small amount of translation, an intermediate piece, which is the role of the biotech companies, which is to take higher risk capital and try to turn ideas into products. And then the larger biopharmaceutical companies, which have access to a lot of capital but are typically a little bit more risk averse, wait for an idea to become mature. So we actually need that early stage investment, and globally, if we're going to be competitive, these kinds of investments are very important. I'll tell you that the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative actively works with about several dozen biotech companies around the world. We have an active program of trying to engage the best ideas in biotech to apply to this problem of HIV vaccines, which companies wouldn't otherwise work on. So, but that technology, that investment actually seeds companies their technology to be used in other fields, and it can be actually good for the American economy to have those kind of investments. So fundamentally recognizing that the government has long played an important role in stimulating new technologies, and that isn't going to go away, especially when it comes to high-risk, early-stage discoveries that are needed.
I'm Junior Bridge, I'm with USA. Did you want to go ahead and say something?
Well, I'll just add one thing and then let you go. The other thing from a policy perspective is to assure that when there are vaccines that come to market that have that value equation, that reimbursement is available. And certainly the Vaccines for Children program in the US has made a huge difference in terms of having that funding available for about the 40 to 45% of those 18 and under who don't have private health insurance and are low income. So continuing policies like that, as well as Medicare reimbursement for vaccines, provides the appropriate incentives to make sure that companies are going to continue to invest.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'm Junior Bridge. I'm a federal contractor with USAID's Global Health Bureau. I wanted to pursue a question that was asked earlier, and also the comment on barriers to vaccines. I understand the economic barriers and the need to cost cut. However, are there other pockets of opposition to the usage of vaccines, cultural or other types of barriers that we who are in communications and education should be looking at as well?
Sure, I'll certainly start out having dealt with that, especially in the US. There are cultural issues. There certain populations don't believe in immunization. Amish, for example, I think is one. But the anti-vaccine groups have probably been the most destructive force in the US in the past several years that is directly responsible, I think, for the deaths of many children. And the accusations that there's a link between vaccines and autism, when many well-designed studies and scientific experts will tell you that this is not disputable, but they continue to scare parents. And parent of a young child who's afraid, gee, my child, if they get a vaccine, is going to get autism. That's a more real fear than is a fear of a disease that they really never heard about. They may be too young to remember polio or measles, etc. So That has been a very tough force to deal with, and the CDC has tried their best, as has the American Pediatrics Group. But I think it's important that everyone understands that choosing to immunize your child is not just going to impact the risk that your child has, it's going to impact the risk that the community has. And that's why there are state mandates, and I know mandates is a terrible word to many groups, but that's why states require immunization before children are allowed into school. But because of the pressures of groups like this, many states now allow someone to opt out for religious, philosophical, or other reasons. And so I'd say that's a major force that has to be dealt with. I don't think it's as true in the world's poorest countries that you have stigma like that, although I know there certainly has been concern about Western medicine and what are they trying to do with me, to me, especially in some of these trials. But perhaps you could address that, John.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. For WHO Afro region, one of the main barriers to vaccine uptake is mainly on the religious aspect, especially the Pentecostal churches. They sometimes really claim that they don't want to use vaccines. So you can find that among the 46 countries in Africa, 10 of them, they have been having always less targeted, rather than less than 90% vaccination in the community. So now there are special efforts to sensitize them, but there is no issue of saying that a vaccine within the expanded program on immunization is causing either autism or the safety issue is not there very much. It's only these religious groups that are having the problem. But also another thing is the geographical location in Africa. The healthcare system, the setup of the healthcare system, that is sometimes biased towards semi-urban areas, not really in the rural. So people who are living in the rural area, sometimes they have difficulties in reaching where the vaccines are being administered. So especially the nomads who are living a nomadic kind of life. So those are the two major reasons of why do people not get vaccination and why do they really be against the vaccination.